Okay, hi there and welcome to a special video looking at behavioural economics, both issues and policy interventions, an update for the 2019 exams. So this revision update video is going to look at some of the topical behavioural economics issues and examples of nudge interventions that are designed to change the behaviour of households, customers and businesses. Richard Thaler, the 2017 Nobel Prize winner, stated that behavioural economics asks questions mostly about the way people make their choices and judgments, or about the way particular financial systems such as retirement and pensions affect those responses. And as we'll see in this video, there's no shortage of economic and social issues and problems to which elements of behavioural science might be applied. Key point to bear in mind, please, is there's no unique model of behavioural economics. What is emerging is an approach that relies more heavily on accumulating evidence using field experiments and then adopting, if you like, a more rigorous cost-benefit assessment of the impact of different nudges. We start this webinar by just revisiting some important behavioural ideas. Loss aversion. This is when we attach a greater value to losses than a similar gain. For example, people often go out of their way to avoid a loss because they feel that pain more deeply than they would a commensurate gain. Bounded rationality is a key concept in behavioural economics, and it happens when we can't really process all of the information, especially in a world of complexity, and therefore we can't make fully informed, fully rational decisions. Present bias is when we prefer immediate gain and immediate gratification to long-term benefits. We'll see that's quite an important aspect of behavioural policy. Choice overload occurs as a result of just too many choices being available to consumers. For example, in the savings market, or the incredible amount of choice when choosing an insurance deal for your car. The default choice is when default options are preset courses of action, and they take effect if nothing is specified by the decision maker. And we'll see this changing the default can be an important behavioural intervention. Presumed consent is also known as an opt-out system and is being used in England from 2020 onwards, when presumed consent will be used for organ donations for everybody aged 18 or over. And just a few more behavioural concepts. Social norms. Social norms are behavioural expectations, if you like, or social rules that operate within a group of people or within a community. Altruism is when people make a sacrifice to benefit other people without expecting a personal reward. Herd behaviour, I'm sure you've come across this one. This is when people do what others are doing instead of using their own information or making their own independent decision, they just follow the herd. And framing, this is where a choice that somebody can make is presented in a way that highlights the positive or the negative aspects of the same decision, leading to a change in the relative attractiveness of the decision. Choice architecture is something beloved of nudge theorists, and that is when you influence a choice by changing the manner in which an option is presented to somebody. So, for example, by setting a different default or by adding decoy options. Now, we're seeing behavioural interventions across a very wide range of markets. Some of these are highly topical, ranging from the products we consume, such as sugar drinks, so the tactics used by hotel booking sites to try and nudge us into making a reservation. And what we'll do in this session is work our way, what I think are some timely and some interesting examples, little case studies of behavioural economics in action. Richard Thaler was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2017 for his contribution to our understanding of how behavioural science can change orthodox economic models. The assumption of pure rationality, of course, has been a cornerstone of traditional theory for many decades, but now we can and we do challenge and question the assumption of rationality in nearly every circumstance. Nudging, and the nice little nudge on the left-hand side here, did you spot, what did you see? Did you see free beer or did you see free Wi-Fi and great beer? Nudging has always been around. Lots of businesses have used nudges for many, many years. The question is now whether we need to move to more sophisticated behavioural interventions. That's sometimes called second generation nudges. And a related question is whether nudging behavioural policy can actually make a significant difference to people and communities at scale. In other words, can we change, for example, the national behaviour when it comes to saving, to pensions, to exercise and to obesity? Can nudges make a big difference? A really good framework for understanding nudging, behavioural nudging, is the EAST framework. Just before we do that, a nudge is any intervention to encourage a behaviour change for better outcomes. And the Behavioural Insights team in the UK are using the EAST framework. If you want to change behaviour, make it easy. So, for example, simply change the default, make a change easy and relatively costless to achieve. Make it attractive, perhaps using some form of financial reward or some other incentive. Crucially, make it social. Humans are social beings. Their behaviour is often strongly influenced and shaped by the choices and behaviour of other people, particularly actually in very close-knit social networks and in smaller communities. Behavioural economics doesn't assume that humans make choices in isolation or just purely to serve their own interest, and so social nudges can be quite powerful at times. And make it timely. Prompt people when they're very receptive. Prompt people, for example, when they've just been ill, or prompt people when they know there's an emergency, and focus on the immediate costs and benefits of changing their behaviour. Let's work through just a few examples, I think, of in 2019 of where behavioural interventions are making a difference. There's a debate with the sugar levy about whether this is truly a nudge or is it just essentially an orthodox tax. My instinct is it's a halfway house. It's both a price intervention, but it's also designed to change behaviour, and there's some evidence that it's doing that. So the sugar tax, officially known as the soft drinks industry levy, but we'll call it the sugar tax, it came into being in the UK in April 2018. There are two bands of tax, one for soft drinks containing more than 5 grams of sugar per 100 ml, and a higher band for drinks containing more than 8 grams of sugar. Certain drinks are currently exempt. Pure fruit juices, milkshakes and yogurt drinks for the moment are exempt. Interestingly, the key thing here is that the sugar levy has both impacted on behavioural change, both for producers and also consumers. So the sugar tax has actually nudged many companies, many drinks makers, to reformulate their products to make sure there's less sugar, so that they're either no longer subject to the tax or they fall within that 5 grams of sugar per mil tax bracket. And from a behavioural economics, reformulation is really appealing because it doesn't actually require people to change their habits. They can keep consuming Coca-Cola, but they're now consuming Coca-Cola Zero or Diet Coke. The other aspect is that if you reformulate your product, the benefits aren't just shared across 1 or 2 people, they're shared across the entire population, including those people who aren't necessarily as health conscious as others. So just looking at the evidence in the last year or so, there's been quite a significant shift in consumer behaviour. I was reading that the sales of classic Coke in the last 12 months are down about 15%. And of course, a lot of drinks companies have brought some new products to market. AG Bar, that make the famous full sugar Iron Brew, beloved in Scotland, they have moved to a lower sugar level Iron Brew, and it's now 40%. The sugar-free variant of that drink is now 40% of the brand. So there's some evidence that the sugar levy is working. There's also been a shift actually towards milk drinks and yogurt drinks, including Yazoo, which at the moment is not part of the levy. This chart, I suppose, just shows some of the initial impact. The distribution of soft drinks, there has been a shift towards the lower sugar drinks and a reduction in the over 8 grams per mil consumption. We'd expect that graph to change even more dramatically, I think, in 2018 and 2019. So the sugar levy, a good example of behavioural policy in action. Another good example of where you can impose what's called a hard nudge is in the market for gambling machines, and in particular fixed odds betting terminals. These are electronic machines normally sited in betting shops. They contain a variety of games, the most popular of which is roulette. Each machine accepts bets for amounts up to a preset maximum and then pays out according to fixed odds on the simulated outcomes of games. So in theory, it's possible to lose a lot of money very quickly. And there's been a link between people's addiction to these games, and major problem gambling. Over 30,000 of these machines in Britain, total gross gambling of nearly £2 billion in 2018. Now, eventually, the government decided that an intervention was needed, and they brought down the maximum stake from £100 to £2. That is a hard nudge. It's designed to slow down the rate at which people lose money. Will the policy nudge work? Well, academic research suggests that the causes of problem gambling are very complex and they're not well understood. It'll be fascinating to see if this particular behavioural nudge has an effect on gamblers. Some evidence, for example, that the gaming industry is going to replace these machines with slightly more complex games or try and find ways of extracting money elsewhere. The rent-to-own market has grown over the years, in part linked to the increase in relative poverty. And essentially, it's where you rent a sofa or a TV over a fixed period of time, and eventually, once you've paid the rent over a certain period of time, you own it. So you might decide to rent a new washing machine and pay in fixed instalments. For example, if you bought a washing machine worth £200, you would rent it over a period of time, but you're paying interest, obviously, before eventually you buy it. Now, the behavioural problem here is that oftentimes the monthly instalments are very low on these washing machines and sofas and TVs. That's called the anchoring effect. In the end, people can spend a lot of money paying for something which, if they'd had a little bit more income, they could have afforded without the need to rent. The Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, extremely worried by this market, and they've decided to intervene. Just as they capped the interest on payday loans, the FCA have now said it wants to cap the rent-to-buy market. It says it wants to reduce the harm to people who rent to own. Oftentimes people end up paying much more, and hundreds of pounds in interest compared to the price of the thing they're buying. So they've now brought in a hard nudge. It's a 100% credit cap, which means that rent-to-own stores such as Bright House can only charge interest up to the value of the product. So if you bought a sofa worth £100, the maximum interest you would pay is £100, £200 in total. Hopefully this will be an important nudge just to protect some of those families on low incomes. Again, there were fears that the rules will cause unintended consequences. So these companies such as Bright House might decide to increase the cost of compulsory theft and accident damage cover or extended warranties, for example, to try and recoup the revenue. We'll see if this works in the months and the years to come. Another good example of a business which is using lots of behavioural tricks to encourage people to take up property is Booking.com and other hotel booking sites. Humans have a very strong scarcity bias. We unconsciously assume things that are scarce are valuable and things that are abundant are not. And the scarcity bias often kicks in when we were told like a product such as a hotel room or a ticket to a sports event is in short supply. Behavioural economics is something that Booking.com really understands, and they use, as you can see on the right hand side here, lots of tricks. In high demand, booked 11 times in the last 24 hours, etc. Only 7 rooms left on our site. Well, the Competition and Markets Authority, that's the UK's main competition watchdog, has intervened to nudge Booking.com to change their ways. They argued that the hotel booking and price comparison websites are manipulating the information they provide to consumers to rush people into making bookings. So now they're not allowed, or they've been told they're not allowed to use these behavioural tricks. They're not allowed to emphasise scarcity bias in the future. And again, we look to see how Booking.com will respond to that. A big change in the UK in the last few months has been the decision last few years, has been the decision by the government to bring in auto-enrolment for pensions. Now, this is a classic example of how changing the default choice can have a big impact on outcomes. So what happened was that the government in 2012 switched from an opt-in system, where people have to sign up, to an opt-out system, where people are automatically in and have to opt out. What happened was that from 2012, anybody earning over £10,000 a year was automatically opted into a pension scheme to which they and the employer both contributed. The main aim of this, of course, is to try and increase saving, to give people a chance to build up their occupational pension pot, to take advantage of compound interest over the very long term. Many people don't understand the power of compound interest over 25, 30 years, and give people a tax-efficient way of increasing their savings. Well, crucially, it seems to have worked. There's been a significant increase in millions more people who are now enrolled. The opt-out rate is around 10%, so 90% of people who have been opted in have chosen to stay in the system. This may go up because contributions will be rising in the years to come. But it's an interesting idea of how changing the default can have a significant impact on savings behaviour. One of the problems is people on low incomes. If you're earning less than £10,000 a year, you're not part of the system. For example, millions of women who are working part-time are prevented from saving as they're earning less than the £10,000 auto-enrolment trigger. That £10,000 may well come down in the years to come. Another big change to the default comes with organ donation. Now, this is yet to happen. It's going to happen from spring 2020. All adults aged over 18 will be considered to have consented to be an organ donor when they die, unless they have recorded a decision not to donate. In other words, they've decided to opt out, or one of certain excluded groups. Thousands of people waiting for organs in the UK on organ transplant lists. 80% of people support organ donation, but in fact only 40% of people in the UK or in England have opted in so far. So from next year, we move to what's called presumed consent. The big question is, will that be transformatory in terms of people's the number of organs donated and also the number of people who are on organ donation lists? It's not inevitable that organ donation will go up. There was a survey recently of opt-in and opt-out countries amongst the OECD countries, and found that compared to opt-in countries, opt-out nations had actually fewer living donors per million population, and there was no significant difference in deceased donors. So we wait to see whether this change in the default is going to have a significant effect. My final example really is one that hit the news over the last couple of years in South Africa, and many places around the world are now suffering and having to address the challenge of water scarcity. If we think back to the early days of 2018, Cape Town was set literally to run dry. I think it was on April the 12th, 2018. Nearly 4 million people resident in Cape Town were going to be without tap water. And the Cape Town authorities called this Day Zero. The problem was, of course, that dams were running dry and that water consumption was simply too high to be sustained. And this is a really interesting example of how behavioural nudges can affect people's behaviour. So the city of Cape Town was desperate to reduce daily water consumption amongst the resident population. And this is really a success story in many ways. They implemented significant water restrictions. They managed to reduce daily water usage by more than half as the crisis got worse. One of the options was a hard nudge. They brought in a limit per person of 50 litres of water per day. But crucially, they then gave people lots of really clear and timely information, if you look on the right-hand side here, about how many litres of water typically is associated with a regular daily routine, like a shower, flushing the toilet, brushing your teeth, for example. So people have very, very clear information. Keep in mind that nearly 3/4 of water usage in most cities is residential. So appealing to social norms and giving people timely information was critical. And Cape Town, I think, did did achieve what it set out to do. There's really strong evidence here that behavioural interventions had a significant effect. Let me highlight for you 3 interventions. The first was the potential latency of social norms and social recognition. So the Cape Town authorities had a water map publicising, recognising homes and communities that are kept within the 50 litre per day limit. They also made social learning quite powerful. They found some trusted influencers on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, and what have you, on WhatsApp, and they were promoting ideas and messages about water consumption. So social learning, social norms, social recognition were powerful. And this, of course, emphasises the social nature of behavioural nudges. Timely real-time information and advice. So they published a chart, they still do in fact, showing the daily water levels in major dams on a dashboard. I'll have a look at that in a second. Very clear information about the proxies. One flush of the toilet about 10 litres per every time you do it. And crucially, they also changed the default. So simply reducing the water pressure, the default water pressure in the entire system, helped to reduce waste and leakages. And a lot of hotels changed the default. They just turned the taps off in restrooms. If you went to the bathroom, there was a hand sanitizer there instead of a tap. Changing the default means that people have to change their behaviour pretty quickly. Here's the example of the daily City of Cape Town down levels report. This information is publicly available so that people can see exactly where the water supplies are. The dam storage currently at 50.3%, and timely information about the sort of average daily water use. Really interesting examples of how Cape Town as a city, as a community, was able to dramatically reduce water consumption. And whether they can continue to do that in the long term, of course, is open to question. But I think a success story. There were some unintended consequences. Many more people started to bore their own private boreholes. Massive increase in demand for butts to collect rainwater. Huge increase in demand for plastic bottles of various sizes, which is perhaps added to the plastic pollution problem. But the immediate crisis was averted. So finally, what are we to say about the usefulness, the impact of behavioural nudges generally? How can we evaluate behavioural interventions? There is no formal behavioural economics model at the moment, so it's kind of quite piecemeal. We look at various case studies and think about what might work and what might not. I just want to make 5 points about behavioural economics, really. One is that nudge theory, behavioural nudges, can help often to change minor behaviours, but they're perhaps less effective in addressing those really deep, systematic, embedded problems such as alcohol dependency, drug dependency, gang violence in our streets. There's not much evidence that behavioural interventions can have a game-changing effect there. It's also quite important to make a distinction between a soft nudge, changing the choice architecture, providing better information to people, and a harder nudge. So a direct control, a direct restriction on cars that can go into a city, restrictions on how many litres of water per day. Those are harder nudges. And often when the problem is immediate, a harder nudge may be required. The third problem is more general. A lot of behavioural economics theory is based on how people behave in laboratories when they're given particular problems to solve. That's changing as we have more field experiments in communities, but the laboratory testing can be biased, particularly if you use mainly white middle-class students. The decisions that those people make in the laboratories are very rarely applicable in the real messy world we live in. The fourth point I think is quite important. Sometimes when you bring a nudge in, it does have an effect. But the question you can ask is, do nudges sustain? Does the impact of a behavioural intervention maintain its efficacy over the long term? Or does it wear off with time? Are there diminishing returns to nudges? And the point I want to finish with is that while nudging can be useful, particularly when you appeal to social norms and you change social behaviours, the impact at scale of nudges is rarely as significant as making a big economic decision. So yes, we can use behavioural nudges perhaps to get people to save a little more, get people to use a little less energy, perhaps choose more sustainable food options. They are useful. But sometimes governments have to make big decisions about changing the prices in markets to change fundamentally behaviour. So I would argue, for example, that a carbon tax, an economy-wide carbon tax, would be a much more significant intervention than any number of behavioural nudges. That's not to say you shouldn't try using nudges, because old habits can be changed into new habits. And there's lots of examples which we've looked at in this video of how behavioural economics can have an impact on the economic and the social choices that people make. Okay, thanks for joining in on this video on behavioural economics.